Deku? I think he's some pro. By clouds. My head in the clouds, not coming down. Chapter 64. Return. Katsuki was sore, but smiling. He didn't know exactly why Mirako had insisted on walking him to the station, but he also wasn't complaining. While he would never admit to her face, Bunny Bitch was pretty cool. And for someone who loudly proclaimed that she didn't even like working with other people, she was actually pretty damn good at it. She'd even somehow managed to keep him from exploding the entire apartment when the news had broken that Deku had somehow spent his internship fighting the hero killer. Sure, she'd pretty much just redirected all of his explosions to her and then slammed him into the ground, but the harder spar had been enough to take all the edge off all that complicated shit that was going on in his brain until he could talk to the mutt again. They pushed through the crowds, blatantly ignoring all the curious stares and whispers that followed them as they made their way to the correct platform. They were just reaching the bottom of the set of stairs when a suicidal reporter decided it was a good idea to stand right in their path. Katsuki Bakugo, you're in Class 1A, right? How do you feel about your classmate fighting the hero killer? Katsuki rolled his eyes and shoved his way past, not even dignifying the stupid bastard with a no comment. Couldn't these extras leave him alone for long enough to get back to UA? Apparently not, because the guy jogged to keep up with them and kept asking dumb questions. Is Deku really quirkless? You went to the same school before UA, so did you know each other? Do you think the video was doctored to make him stronger than he is? What the fuck? Katsuki couldn't help stopping in his tracks and looking at the reporter with exasperated confusion. Why the fuck would anyone put that much effort to make the nerd look stronger? He doesn't even want to be popular. Well, The reporter stuttered slightly as he tried to organize whatever conspiracy bull was about to spill out of his mouth, but before he could continue, Katsuki felt Midako elbow him hard in the ribs. When he glowered up at her, she was wearing a sharp smile that he couldn't help imitating, as the two of them turned back to the reporter. Would you be able to fight a serial killer? Mirako asked, a little too pleasantly. Even with whatever lame quirk you've got? Deku may not have a quirk, Katsuki grinned. But he could still probably kick your ass. But he'll never get a chance if I kick it first, which is what I'll do if you don't leave and let me get back to school. Katsuki held his hands at the ready for explosions to emphasize his point, as the reporter squeaked and ran off. The crowd that had gathered to eavesdrop on the interaction started applauding, and Katsuki grinned wider as Midako held her sides in laughter. Yeah, a lot of heroes can't get away with treating a reporter like that, she chuckled. So I'm glad I chose you. You get to be an asshole and call it your brand. Whatever. Katsuki rolled his eyes, but kept smiling. Why did you choose me anyway? You never work in teams, much less take on interns and sidekicks like other heroes. Midako shrugged. I wanted to see if you could kill me. Katsuki cocked an eyebrow skeptically. Seriously? She laughed loudly. Yep, I saw you fighting that gravity girl in the sports festival, and thought it'd be a nice change of pace to spar with someone who doesn't hold back, or assume their opponent is weak just because of a little thing like gender or quirk. It wasn't out of some weird desire to nurture the next generation or anything like that. I'm just selfish. Katsuki scoffed as his train pulled into the station. You're insane. So are you, Blasty. She cuffed him over the head, and pulled him in a headlock and ruffled his hair. Now get out of here. You've still got a pack for those new dorms the rat just announced. Ugh, don't remind me. Katsuki pushed her away and ran a hand through his hair, which only succeeded in messing it up more. I'm gonna have to deal with those idiots all day. Sucks to suck! Mirako yeeted his bag onto the train, forcing Katsuki to chase after it and glare at her when the door to the train closed. "Good luck, Blasty." "Don't need it," Katsuki yelled back. "I'm strong enough to fight when it counts." "Mom," Momo asked slowly, folding another shirt and putting it neatly in one of the many open suitcases in her room. There was a lot of stuff to move into the dorms. Why did you decide to be a sexy hero?" Mom stopped sorting through Momo's teas and frowned. "Momo, honey, what brought this on?" "Well, Momo hesitated. Would Mom be disappointed if she knew that Momo would learn more from Kendo on her internship than she had from Uwabami? Mom sighed. "It was your internship, wasn't it? Uwabami, well, she used to be an amazing hero. Still is in many ways, but while I try to use my fame to enhance my hero work, her and a lot of others do it the other way around." "Oh," Momo said softly. "So, you decided to be sexy because it would help you be a better hero?" Mom shook her head. "I decided to be sexy because I wanted to be," she said seriously. "It made me feel powerful." "So, you didn't decide on your brand because you had to be sexy to be a good hero?" Momo clarified. "You didn't need to be sexy because that's what the people needed or something?" Mom wrinkled her nose in disgust. "God, no. In fact, people made me change my first hero costume because what made me feel badass was too much for some people. Honey," Mom sat on the bed beside her, oversized sweater pulling around her as she grabbed both of Momo's hands and looked at her straight in the eyes. "You should never make decisions based on the male gaze. You need to do what makes you feel good. For me, embracing my sexuality does that, but I didn't decide on my brand to appeal to men or to be more popular. You don't owe anyone anything just to be popular. Does that make sense?" "It's just that Uwabami," Momo stuttered quietly. "Isn't the only expert," Mom said decisively. "Popularity is important, but you know what else is important? Saving people?" Momo suggested. Mom shook her head. You, Momo, are important. If you are happy and confident, you'll be a better hero. If that means having a sexy costume, have a sexy costume. And if it doesn't, then would it be okay to change my costume to something a little more practical?" Momo finished. "I was working with Kendo and we came up with a few ideas." Mom smiled softly. "Whatever makes you happy, honey." Toshinori paid the driver and steeled his nerve. When he told Gran Torino that he wanted to spend a few days visiting, and that he had something he wanted to discuss with him, Gran had insisted they go to a cabin in the middle of the woods. He'd had it for as long as Toshinori had known him, saying that he needed a place to go off the grid when dealing with all the idiots in the hero industry got to be too much. It was where they'd gone to hide away after Nana's death. He walked up the long driveway, coughing a few times as he dragged his small suitcase along the gravel. He hadn't wanted to come back here, mostly because there was no place to run if Gran decided to knock some sense into him, but Gran had insisted. "I can tell that whatever's on your mind is important, Toshi, but you have this stupid habit of running off." Toshinori had grimaced and coughed blood, but Gran had simply continued the phone call, his unimpressed expression coming across perfectly, even though they weren't face to face. I don't want you having the excuse that Japan needs you or whatever. There are other heroes, and I'm not having you disappear in the middle of whatever we're dealing with to go off and fight some villain. Hence, the middle of nowhere. Nezu can send a car for you, or whatever if it's an emergency, but there's not even cell service out here, so we can have our little chat uninterrupted. Granted then hung up before Toshinori could protest further, leaving him no choice but to show up and trap himself off the grid with his mentor. When the front porch of the cabin came into view, Gran was already waiting for him, arms crossed as he leaned against the doorframe. A part of Toshinori was glad there was no possibility of this conversation being interrupted by an emergency. The other part of him was just very afraid. Chapter 65. Back to school. It was weird living somewhere that wasn't his room. Well, actually, Izuku supposed that the dorm was technically his room, but at the same time, it didn't feel like his yet. At least when he'd been on internships, he'd known he was a guest. But now this was supposed to be his new home for the next few years. It didn't feel real yet. At least he hadn't had to deal with the crazy reporters who were still camping outside the gates. Thankfully, Nezu had suggested that him and the other students involved in the horseshoe incident arrived in the early morning, to avoid the worst of the mob, and even then the press was being held back by a police line to protect the students. Izuku knew that he'd probably have to give an interview or something eventually, especially with how a video detailing Stain's ideology was currently going viral right alongside the video of his takedown. But Izuku was more than happy to let Nezu handle the press interactions for as long as possible. At the very least, it gave him time to come up with a good strategy to deal with the publicity, the same way he'd strategized to deal with the villains, right? Izuku sighed and retied his tie for the third time. Between Nezu and Eraser, he knew theoretically the steps he was supposed to take to get the knot to look somewhat normal, but it was still going to take a lot of practice to break whatever weird habits he'd acquired while trying to learn on his own. In the end, the knot was still a little too big and lumpy, but the tie had ended up at the correct length, and the front was longer than the back, so he was going to count it as a win. The kitchen was slightly chaotic when he arrived, though Izuku didn't know what else he expected from 20 teenagers all being thrown into the same house together. It's literally the same thing as a toaster, Kaminari insisted. Isn't that dangerous? Momo asked, looking at the still untoasted bread in concern. It would really be much better to use a toaster, rather than trying to use your quirk. The stalemate was broken when Todoroki reached past her to grab a slice of bread with his left hand, and toasted it perfectly, maintaining eye contact with her the whole time. Izuku tried to hide his snickers at the exasperated look on Momo's face as Todoroki, still maintaining eye contact, took a bite from his freshly toasted bread without even bothering to butter it first, before turning to Kaminari. I agree. The handprint is kind of annoying. Use a toaster, Kaminari. Was this how things were going to be from now on? It was difficult to be late for class when it was only a 5-minute walk. That, of course, meant that Ida's empty desk felt all the more conspicuous when the bell rang. All right, class, settle down, Aizawa said boredly. I know you're all sick of each other by now, but you're gonna have to get used to living in the dorms. So let's get... Aizawa-sensei? Uraraka raised her hand hesitantly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you know where Ida is? Ida has been suspended, Aizawa responded matter-of-factly. When the class tried to explode into shocked muttering, he activated his quirk and glared at them all until they were shifting uncomfortably, but silently, in their seats.
Do we need to review the lessons on hero licenses and vigilantism? While Nezu did end up giving your classmates emergency permission to fight in Hosu, the fact remains that Ida originally sought out the hero killer, and we need to be sure that he will not repeat such behavior in the future, before he will be allowed to return to class. Do I make myself clear?
The class nodded solemnly, and Izuku couldn't help the feeling that Ida was lucky to have been given the option to return at all. It was probably, at least partially, because he only went off the deep end in response to his brother's injury, which made him sympathetic. And the rest was probably because the whole media situation was already a fiasco, without adding an expulsion to the list. But Izuku hoped that Ida would be able to get his act together eventually, if only for the people he would eventually save. Aizawa sighed loudly.
Let this be a warning to you. Your quirks and your training are valuable tools, but they are also weapons, and cannot be used for personal gain or revenge without consequences. Keep that in mind moving forward, and you'll be better off than half the heroes out there. Now, let's review the laws surrounding quirk use.
When Izuku arrived for his lesson with Nezu, the principal had 10 different newspapers spread across his desk, and at least 2 broadcasts streaming. But he still smiled and got up to pour them both some tea, as Izuku sat down. So, it looks like we were right about the hero killer, Izuku said, taking the cup that Nezu offered him. Unfortunately. Nezu's expression twisted into an unhappy scowl, and it appears that the media has taken the Nomu attack as more than a mere coincidence. So those galvanized to action by the hero killer's ideology will most likely flock to the League of Villains.
Wonderful,
Izuku said dryly. This is why you said it's better to discredit popular villains before... Don't be silly, Midoriya, Nezu chirped. If we had not captured him when we had, both Ida and Native would be dead. It is only due to his capture that he gained his popularity. So, overall this may not be an ideal situation, but that just means it is more of a challenge, correct? Nezu's eyes sparkled with contagious excitement, and Izuku couldn't help but respond with a determined nod. Yes, sir. Good. Nezu smiled and took a sip of his tea. So, how should we begin? Izuku let his mind turn over a few possibilities. Well, the main issue is that, objectively, Stain was right. The hero system does need to be reformed, and there are too many heroes that are only in it for the fame or the money, rather than to save people. Is that an issue? Nezu asked. Izuku looked at him incredulously. Yes. How are we supposed to discredit someone who is right? Oh, there are ways, Nezu replied. We could always try to convince the people of a comfortable lie, the way the Hero Commission tends to. Somehow, I don't think he'll choose that option. Or, we could try praising his ideals while simultaneously condemning his actions. I think that last one wouldn't be well received, Izuku brought up. Wouldn't that run the risk of being seen as a little too late? Especially when Stain was so action-based. That's what often happens in debates about violent protests, right? So? Nezu prompted. So, we need some other action to channel people towards that isn't murder. Izuku brushed aside one of the newspapers so he had a place to set down his cup. Maybe we could bring up how Stain's murders didn't actually spread his ideology. It was the attack with the fewest injuries that did that. Exactly. Nezu smiled and took another sip of his tea. Most of the victims became martyrs of the hero community, rather than being discredited like Stain had hoped. Izuku grinned. We can use Stain's popularity to reform the hero system. Talk about how murders make martyrs and push for change within the system. We can even use Endeavor to help, and redirect people's focus to finding and eradicating villains within the system, rather than becoming villains themselves. It's a decent start, Nezu began, although there are some concerns we'll need to manage. Their conversation was interrupted by a harsh ring that echoed through the office, and Izuku was certain that if he was still holding his tea, he would have spilled it all over the papers on Nezu's desk. No one ever called during their lessons. Was it an emergency? Nezu frowned and checked his phone. Why would Aizawa be calling at this hour? He's assisting Snipe and teaching the 3rd years. I believe they were doing a combat exercise today. He answered the call on speaker, chirping cheerily. Aizawa, what a wonderful surprise.
We're under attack!
Aizawa's voice echoed over the receiver.
I can't see the villain, so can't erase their quirk, and they're trying to capture one of the students. I've never seen this quirk before. It acts just like my capture weapon, so I can't get a hold of it. And Snipe can't shoot without hitting Torgata. I need backup.